Welcome back, grade 7s. This is lesson 4.5, Converging in the West. In this lesson, we are going to learn how did the fur trade in the West bring various peoples together. So stick around and let's learn something. How did the fur trade in the West bring various people together? This is, like I mentioned, lesson 4.5, Converging in the West. So there is some major competition between the French and the English, but the 7 Years' War, we're going to see about that a little bit later, that's going to end any competition. Because, spoiler alert, the English win this war, the French lose, which means just the end of the French fur trade. The French are still there, though. They settle in the Great Lakes lowland. They end up marrying First Nation women, and they have the very first Métis, which, that's going to be chapter 8. We'll learn about that later on. So let's get started. Well, we've heard of the Hudson's Bay Company, but there is also another company, the Northwest Company, which was developed in 1779. So 179 years after the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company is established. These are called the Nor'westers, and they're French traders from Montreal who have returned to the fur trade, who decided that they're going to blend and have a mix of French and English trading traditions, which is going to make them pretty successful. So the Nor'westers extends the fur trade. And just like the Hudson's Bay monopoly that existed back in the 1600s, they had one goal and they had one goal only: make money. And along the way, they improved their ties with the First Nations because they're blending that French and English tradition of trading together. And the First Nations really like that, the fact that they are going to come to the First Nations to trade. And they weren't called coureurs de bois, they called themselves voyageurs. And they were a mix of Canadiens and Métis. If you remember from the last lesson, Métis, or actually at the beginning of this lesson, these are European fathers, First Nation women. Their children are the Métis. So, Nor'westers, the Northwest Company. And there's a problem. And we remember from the transportation of the previous lesson, there's no planes, there's no trains, there's no automobiles. Okay, so any post that is made, and the Voyageurs and the Northwest Company did make trading posts, it was far from Montreal, and they needed to get back to Montreal. So what they did instead is they built a fort in the middle of the fur trade at Fort William, which was on Lake Superior. And the people that were at this fort, they were named inlanders. Sometimes they were called winterers. And the furs were brought in from the First Nations. And from Montreal, the canoes would bring in goods and supplies. And they would meet in the middle at Fort William. They would trade. They would have a huge party to celebrate. Then they would make their way back. And it took a really long time for them to get back to Montreal. So that's why this fort was built there in the middle. It made it easier for everybody. It was a neutral ground, and everybody could be successful. So the voyageurs, you can see here in the picture, they use these long canoes, and they worked for the good of the people. And if you pay attention now, you'll see this phrase pop up again in grade 8 social. But they worked to benefit the people. They spoke, obviously, they're from Montreal, so they're speaking French, but they're Canadiens and they're Métis, which means that they're going to be able to speak a number of First Nation languages as well. And it was French that was the language of the Western fur trade, because this is where the Métis are. And the Métis usually had French fathers, so the language is going to follow. The voyageurs permanently settled in the West eventually, and then they would continue to spread that French language, and they would spread that way of life, and they would mix that with the First Nations. Later on in our story of Canada, specifically chapter 8, we're going to take a really close look at this. And the Northwest Company and the Voyageurs, they stayed around until 1821. Things got violent. There was some uprisings that are in present-day Manitoba, which we'll learn about later on in our history and story of Canada. But long story short, all we need to know right now is that the Hudson's Bay Company takes over the Northwest Company in 1821. And we'll go into more detail of that later on in our story of Canada. But we're going to take a look much closer to the Northwest Company here in Alberta. It's important to know in this part of Canada, we are considered here in Alberta, Western Canada. Americans from the US, they were also interested in the fur trade, especially that of the northern fur trade. That's because the beaver had thicker pelts in northern Canada. And an American by the name of Peter Pond, he actually came into the Hudson's Bay territory and he built a post on the Athabasca River. And this is the very first trading post in Alberta. And he built this because he didn't want to travel all the way to York Factory where the Hudson's Bay was. So he built this fort here instead. And the Athabasca River, the Athabasca River post, the one made by Peter Pond, is eventually renamed and replaced by Fort Chipewyan, which is on Lake Athabasca. So it's in northern Alberta. And eventually this becomes the first European community in Alberta. Now, if you're from Alberta, it's hard to believe that the first European community is actually going to be that far north, but that's what the fur trade did. The fur trade went out and explored and expanded and opened up all of this territory. Now, there's some fierce competition that existed between the two companies, between the Northwest Company and between the Hudson's Bay Company. It was actually very violent, and we'll touch a little bit on that here. The Nor'westers' fur trade extended west to Peace River and to Mackenzie River. You can see kind of on the map there that those are the rivers in Alberta. And they built these posts along the way. Guess who else was doing the same thing? Hudson's Bay Company was doing the same thing. There was this competition over the territory here in Alberta. This competition drove the prices up for fur. And you'll learn more about supply and demand in grade 9 social. But if everybody wants the fur, if everybody wants these beaver pelts, that is going to increase the value of those beaver pelts. This competition not only did it drive up prices for fur, but also led to violence as well. Okay, and that's going to be a problem much later on. And then what the Europeans did is they started trading alcohol for these furs. And this was really ruining the relationships that the First Nations were having with the Europeans. So things are really starting to take a downward spiral, and things are getting really, really bad. And this is going to eventually cause the Northwest Company to kind of surrender, but the HBC essentially takes them over in 1821. And again, we'll talk about this later in our story of Canada. But some of the things some positives that came out of this was that we were able to finally cross the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean. And it was those Rockies that kept the voyageurs from pushing west. There seemed to be no way through these mountains. It wasn't until Alexander Mackenzie, who was a Nor'wester, figured out its solution. First, though, in 1789, instead of crossing the Rockies, he reaches the Arctic Ocean. Now, that is a feat in itself, and that should be a celebrated accomplishment, but that wasn't his goal. His goal was to reach the Pacific Ocean, so he named the river of Disappointment, because he was exactly that. He was disappointment. But a few years later, he tries again. This time, he takes Peace River from Lake Athabasca. He takes Peace River through the mountains, and he's able to make his way to the Pacific Ocean. And this happens in 1793. And that's a huge accomplishment, because we'll see later that that is a really important thing to do. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.